Hello and welcome to the new Fi Compass Jam Sessions podcast. I'm Anna Zurek, your host and financial instruments advisor at the European Investment Bank. Today we're diving into the fascinating world of equity instruments under the European Regional Development Fund, the ERDF, and how they're giving a boost to Europe's most innovative startups. Europe is a hub for creativity with great research institutions and universities, multinational technology companies, and groundbreaking ideas sprouting up in sectors like green tech, mobility, healthcare, energy, just to name a few. However, securing funding for those startups in Europe might not be so easy. I am pleased to welcome two distinguished guests to our podcast today. Vivi Papasouli, Mandate Manager for Greece, Bulgaria, and Cyprus from the European Investment Fund, and Henrik Dyrssen, Project Manager Financial Instruments in the Swedish Agency for Economic and Regional Growth. They will tell us more about their experiences with ERDF equity for innovation in these two countries from two different perspectives of an ERDF managing authority and a holding fund manager. And we will also discuss with them their ambitions for the future in this regard. Welcome to the podcast, Vivi and Henrik.
Thank you, Anna. Greetings from Greece. Great being here with you.
Thank you. I'll say hi here from the north of Sweden. Humbled to be here.
Throughout the recent years, equity investment has emerged in the EU as a potent tool to nurture innovative companies. And the EU has been making progress in terms of RDI investment. That's the positive message. But compared to heavyweights such as the US and China, for example, it still seems to lag significantly behind. It is worth underlining that innovation is a centerpiece of EU cohesion policy, also in the current programming period. And ERDF resources channeled through equity instruments can be a powerful tool to power Europe's innovative startups. And countries like Greece and Sweden have set great examples by deploying a range of equity instruments with ERDF resources to support their innovative companies. The forward-thinking approach of involved institutions, such as managing authorities and the holding fund managers, created new opportunities for their companies, for their startup scene, with some of these companies even achieving the unicorn status. So let's start. Europe is a mosaic of different environments, and this surely applies as well when we consider innovative startups. Vivi, how is innovation thriving in Greece and what are the biggest challenges for Greek startups?
Yeah, so Anna, I think Greece is definitely an interesting environment in terms of entrepreneurial skills and research ideas. It has been ranking very high for years and years in terms of availability of scientists and engineers, and also in terms of funded applications per million of inhabitants in global indexes. It also has a good reputation in terms of universities and research centers and strong academia. Now, that said, all of this doesn't always translate into commercialization of these ideas into the real market. Greece has also suffered in the past from many years of deep economic crisis that lasted more than 10 years. That has led to a big brain drain. As there are always two sides of its coin, this brain drain has also strengthened the Greek diaspora that has always been also a big asset for the country. We now see signs of reversing of this brain drain, what we call a brain gain. This is still underway and definitely has still a long way to go. All of that said, based on the most recent research market analysis of the EIF data, the country is still lagging behind in terms of SMEs access to finance in comparison to its EU counterparts. And when we start looking into the actual market, the VC ecosystem was very nascent when EIF started deploying its initiatives in the market. There was close to zero financing for innovative companies, close to zero equity financing in the very early stages of their development. And although the VC and private equity ecosystems have evolved in Greece over the past 7 to 8 years, there is still a way to go in terms of evolving the equity market in Greece.
Thank you very much, Vivi. It sounds quite challenging, but it seems as well that certain activities have been undertaken and also provide some fruits already. So that's great to hear. And Sweden is the highest ranked EU country in the 2023 WIPO innovation ranking. Congratulations. That sounds really great. But can you tell us maybe what is the key to success in this regard for a country such as Sweden? And does it mean that innovative companies do not have any big challenges in Sweden, for instance, instruments in terms of access to finance. Henrik, how do you see it?
It's an interesting story. The rankings are, something to take with a bit of humility because it's averaged indexed ranking. So if you peer below the hood of the car, you see we're 18th on institutions, driven by a 48th rank on business environment. But obviously other factors panned out to a positive result in this particular ranking. But it doesn't mean that it's the full story. We do have unicorns, a lot of them by comparison, but their valuation's not necessarily top-notch in a global perspective. Where our perhaps strengths come from are a significant presence of large companies that buy, sell, innovate, and provide a demand for innovation, and has done so for many, many decades. And that stems from, the coming out of the Second World War relatively unscathed, and the golden years of the 50s and 60s. So since then, there's been a strong momentum in Sweden in terms of industrial and technological development. We're still riding pieces of that wave. But other elements have come into the fore. We do have productive and competitive universities that are reasonably competitive at a national scale, some of them very much so. We have now decades of public support programs for innovation and SMEs that we're counting in the decades, and that formed some part of building an innovation system, not the least. Public support also for digitization in the 90s was very strong, and then followed by consumer demand for digital innovation, which has been very helpful for that sector, combined with kind of development of the financial sector warming up to supporting digital innovation. The VC scene is huge. The risk capital scene is huge per capita. I think it's up there with the United States and Israel in terms of global leaders per capita. But it's also a couple of decades old and has become more and more professionalized, and perhaps not as risk-willing as it used to be. So that paints a picture of a good underlying demand for innovation, a good broad support system for innovation. But the world moves fast, as we're learning through the later years. And the interesting thing is, does this system stand up to accelerating with a par with innovations, new innovations in digital, new green innovations, and demand for such policies? And other countries are accelerating. Will we keep pace just because we're in a relatively strong position for the small country we are?
Thank you, Henrik, for this comprehensive introduction to the situation in Sweden. And it's quite interesting to hear that the sooner you plant the seed and start, basically then through long-term strategies and combination of different stakeholders, you can reach this kind of results. Vivi, now we often hear that equity instruments are still underused, and compared to other ERDF, co-financed financial products, so the debt instruments, there seems to be still a reluctance to believe in the power of equity instruments. On the other hand, in many member states and regions, the VC ecosystems are still not very developed since compared to what we just heard about Sweden. From your perspective and experience, because you're working in a number of countries, why are ERDF equity instruments the right tool and necessary to support our innovative startups? And maybe how did you launch Equifund in Greece? What's the story behind it, and how did it change the financing landscape? And perhaps you can briefly explain a little bit what actually Equifunds encompasses, and how are you involved as EIF in these instruments?
Sure, Anna, thanks. It sounds like with Sweden, other than being on the two different borders of the EU, we're also in the two borders of the VC ecosystem. So I hear there's huge, VC there per capita. I guess Greece is on the other side of that story. So I think, first of all, just to set the record straight, equity is a niche financing tool. And that I think we need to be very clear from the onset. It's not for everybody. It targets very high risk, very high potential companies that can grow extremely fast. So by default, it is not for everyone. It is not a tool that all companies can use, and it by no means to substitute other financing, targeting more traditional companies that would by default go to banking loans or would be financed by a more traditional, let's say, financing resources. Now, that said, there are EU regions where the equity financing is really, really underdeveloped. So nothing to do like this we heard Henrik describing for Sweden, Greece being one of them. So when we started the story of Equifund back in 2016 in Greece, the ecosystem was nascent. There was practically nothing on the ground. We had implemented the Jeremy initiative 4 or 5 years prior to that, but the Jeremy initiative was very, very scarce in terms of resources and scope. It had been finished more than a year ago, so there was a financing gap in the market, and Greece was still struggling amidst a huge economic crisis back in 2015-16. So Equifund was launched as a 200 million initiative of the Greek government. It was financed by ERDF resources. EIF did contribute its own resources of another 60 million, and it was a new initiative in terms of depth and breadth. It targeted all investment stages from the VC all the way to the private equity through 3 distinct windows. So we had the innovation window targeting pre-seed and seed investments. So projects and research ideas at initial stages that beginning to evolve to enterprises. We had the early stage window that targeted a bit more mature companies that had already developed a product or had some clients already on the market. And we had the growth window that was targeting well-established companies, usually in more traditional sectors of the market. It didn't have a specific target in terms of sectors. All sectors could potentially be targeted by all windows. The idea being that we launched a call that was pretty flexible and we waited for the market to react and see what we could get out of the market. Now, the EIF was entrusted by the Hellenic Republic to manage the fund of funds as the fund of fund manager. We ran the selection procedure that resulted in the selection of the 9 fund managers, and we monitored and stayed close to the ecosystem ever since then. Equifund portfolio now amounts to 140 companies in total throughout the whole 3 windows, and we have managed to mobilize 8 times the ERDF money invested when considering the aggregate investments at final recipients level, which is a very, very interesting leveraging amount.
Congratulations. The leverage is really impressive, and also the broad range of products. Perhaps also to mention that we are extremely pleased to be able to feature the impact of Equifund in Greece again during the FICOMPAS workshop on 26th, 27th of February in Athens, where our guests today will also be speakers. For those who cannot participate in this event, we encourage you to read the FICOMPAS case study about Equifund, which is available on our website and will be linked in the transcript. And we also have a video case study with interviews from the different involved stakeholders, which we also encourage you to have a look at. Both links will be in the transcript of this podcast episode, so enjoy these resources as well. And Henrik, you work in equity instruments already for a lot of years. Your expertise goes way back, I guess, before working with ERDF and before joining the managing authority. From your perspective, why is equity the right product to support early stage innovative companies? And maybe a little bit as well about why Sweden decided to, if I understand correctly, as well implement a range of equity instruments with ERDF.
Yeah, I like what Vivi said in terms of the interesting things happening on the margins of Europe here. As an economist, I think that everything interesting happens on the margins. That's where the juice is. But we started out around 2000, just before 2007, with our first generation venture capital. And the motivation for that was really to spread capital around, because even if Sweden as a market, as a country, has a large venture capital scene, it doesn't mean that there's not regions of Sweden, being one of Europe's largest countries, actually, not economically, but geographically. We have a lot of countryside, a lot of less developed areas with smaller towns and cities, but they have flourishing entrepreneurship. And if you're not that close to Stockholm, Gothenburg, or Malmö, or 3 big cities, you're not close to a significant financial center. So the policy was oriented around democratizing capital, which I guess the Greeks could appreciate, and providing access also beyond the financial hubs, as well as the kind of common notion that there's always a healthy restriction of early stage capital. Not every company should be funded, but there's also an opportunity there where you can find companies that don't necessarily are able to finance themselves very easily in the markets that could be financed. And if you develop the mechanisms for that, such as we're discussing here, you could provide some added value in terms of growth and employment and so forth. So doing that in the bigger cities, just complementing the local, relatively well-developed market, and then making sure there was at least one professional investor in the other regions of Sweden. And I think that's the key role that that part of the system played, that it's been the one professional investor that's always there, that can provide guidance, support, and attract and motivate angels locally, business owners, investors, families, to kind of piggyback off of someone with a professional process. I think that's been helpful to there's a hypothesis, at least, that that's been helpful to grow regional capital provision outside of the big cities. Now, that was the first generation. With the second generation, we were in a slightly different market, and the market analysis deepened as well. The VC market in Sweden, developed as it was, took a huge hit in the 2008 financial crisis. I think it was almost 95% of funds got closed, and it started coming back again, but there was a notion that the volumes of early stage capital that we'd seen previously in the digital kind of boom era of the dot-com boom and so forth, that had taken a setback. So there was a need for general early stage capital. And for that, we turned to the EIF and a fund-of-fund model that is trying to get some more teams, some of the first new teams onto the market. Some of those have been absolutely sort of catalytic in the market. And at the same time, there was a fervor for green policy making, which led into a clean tech fund. And that was a bit of an experiment, I guess you could say, policy supported experiment, but a hypothesis. Now, in the third generation, and in the second generation, the regional motives have kind of continued to stay, and the support for the regional venture capital funds have stayed. The need for more general VC capital and new funds has maybe lessened because the VC cycle has matured and there's a lot of funds again. But in an area such as Stockholm, the regional capital was now geared towards deep tech because we have so much general capital in Stockholm that maybe a more specific strategy was a little bit more complementing the market or easier to argue for in that regard. And the experience of our first green fund also showed that fund, together with others, was at times the only clean tech capital available for early stage until maybe 2018, when the interest started growing in early stage growth capital for clean tech again. So the notion of a second generation of a clean tech fund garnered, support also, obviously, along with policy support for the developing policy cycle of the climate agenda. So it's been a deepening experience, partly data-based, partly policy motivated, partly, feedback mechanism of like, is this working? Is this useful? And do we see that we still have a relevant market complementing role? And based on that, we continue to develop instruments.
It's quite interesting, this approach that you followed to mix basically regional funds with also some that tackle specific sector areas, and also very, for ERDF financing, quite innovative ones, like for instance, the green financial instrument. And can you tell us a little bit how that worked for you? Did you have enough companies to finance that really work to have this kind of more narrow down approach to the sectors that the instrument covered?
It's always a hen and egg problem, is the market there? And I think we were lucky with this timing that the policy fervor for green tech kind of there around 2014, when it started last sort of regional fund period, that was also in fact reflected in the markets. And when the fund came online in, I think 2016 or 18, I have to check my, with 30 instruments, it starts to get a bit shifty on the details. But at the same time, growth capital started to pick up a little bit, so noticing a positive market trend. But the trend in the market was for early stage growth capital, not early stage or pre-seed, seed rounds. So we saw a role where we could be a feeder fund for this growing growth capital for clean tech. And it's been interesting to kind of figure out where a clean tech fund goes from there, given the kind of rapidly developing environment. An element of that has been something perhaps that you wouldn't think of the first time, is operational integrity. So if you have, in our case, it was a public investor, a public organization that had the mandate. And when the market around it grows, their staff, who are now experts in clean tech, become very attractive in the market. So how do you keep, resource integrity over time? Fund runs for, many years. Our funds run for over 15 years. But another lesson was how powerful and promising. We're still in evaluation, and we'll keep evaluating in the green element and the kind of carbon reduction. But what we're seeing is how powerful venture capital can be as a green policy instrument, because you finance innovation that in turn bolsters industrialization of new green practices, products, and so forth, which in turn turns into scale, green, development at scale. So if you can measure that first, second, third tier kind of effects, it's suggestively, it's quite substantial. And the companies have continued to grow, and it's been an interesting challenge of trying to keep the fund in the early stages while at the same time giving it operational freedom to also make bigger bets and follow on into growth where it's needed. And so the Green Fund has quite a wide mandate, but I think that the end, how it supported its portfolio, it's made a choice between partly supporting very early stage and partly supporting promising growth companies that still do have a challenge kind of finding that market financing.
Thank you, Henrik. This is really interesting. And we're also extremely happy that we can feature your example as well. We have featured already the ex-ante process in a case study, and we are currently as well working with you and the colleagues to describe the financial instrument in more detail in another case study. So for all listeners, stay tuned in the next month for this new resource with us. And Vivi, an important topic as usual, the selection of fund managers at the ERDF. How do you approach this topic? Maybe you can share with our listeners some secrets, what is especially important when selecting the right fund managers?
Well, I think the EAF is notorious for its thorough selection process when it comes to fund managers, and I'm sure a lot of fund managers out there would have a lot of stories to share from their side that have gone through this process. Now, the European Investment Fund has a dedicated experienced team of our equity professionals that are sitting in Luxembourg and are responsible for the selection and evaluation of the applicants, of our fund managers. And this is irrespectively of the mandates we sign and of the regions where we deploy the resources. I think this is extremely important to already clarify because, first of all, these experienced teams of the EIF bring on pan-European experience. So it's very important that they have the whole of the expertise in-house to select the professionals we want to work with, irrespectively of the regional mandates we bring on the table. And they also bring their objectivity, irrespectively of the specificities of the mandate that we as mandate managers bring for its country or its region. Now, I think in brief, and this is just a list of criteria that we look into, obviously, due diligence is not just a checklist of yes or no, so take everything with a pinch of salt here. But I think the key criteria our teams assess include look into the management team and whether this management team brings in the experience we want, the skill sets we want, what the composition looks like, the track record they bring on, and the stability and commitment they can have for the life cycle of the fund, because this is, as we always say, this is a long-term marriage. Basically, we all come into it's a long-term investment in terms of time and commitment. We look into the market they target and whether it makes sense, the market need, the feasibility of the strategy, the competitors that already exist, and the differentiation of the team and the unique selling proposition they have. We look into the deal flow, the track record they have, the quality and relevance, the credibility of the plans to develop that deal flow on the market, the investment strategy they bring on the table, so the fund size, sector, geographical focus, the number of targeted investments, etc. We look into the fund size, so minimum target size, maximum size, the balance between the fund sizes and follow-on investments, how it will all develop. The proposed terms, so the operational budget, including the fees they propose, the costs, hurdle rates, carried interest, etc. The expected returns, so we need some evidence that the fund is to be run on a commercial basis and that it can be expected to be financially viable. The investor base, evidence of support from other investors, and expected timing of first and final closing. And obviously, we need independence of the team that is making investment and divestment decisions. This is also key for the EIF. So this is just the list of criteria. Obviously, it is a combination of all of these criteria that our teams assess for the successful applicants that actually make it to the due diligence stage with our experts in Luxembourg.
This sounds very, very comprehensive and a very complex and tough process. I guess that experience of the fund managers is surely very important in providing this information. But does it mean that first-time teams don't have a chance? And how was it maybe in Equifund? Were there some first-time timers that participated in Equifund?
I would say, Anna, on the contrary, first-time teams are always welcome to the EAF, and this actually comes hand in hand with our regional business, which I'm also part of. It's intrinsic in the development mandates we implement and the way we help nurture ecosystems in Europe that are not as developed. If the EAF did not entrust and supported first-time teams, the ecosystems we developed in Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, in all of these countries would have never developed. Because it's always a notion that, underdeveloped ecosystems lack startups. In reality, they also lack the experience of existing teams on the ground as well. So first-time teams are always welcome. They just need to bring on the table the elements that we discussed in a combined way. For example, the level of the expertise of the management team. Obviously, an established team will bring in its previous generation fund, but a new team can always bring in separate CV, separate expertise, separate track record, and can build together a complementary team, bringing together complementary skill sets from different backgrounds. All in all, in my view, established teams do not have an advantage. I'm afraid both emerging and existing teams will still have to go through the rigorous due diligence process EIF has become famous for in the EU VC market.
And did the landscape of fund managers change throughout the recent years in Greece? How did they evolve in the time working with you as part of Equifund?
I think it has changed significantly. As I mentioned, nascent ecosystems come with nascent experience at all levels. So both startups, fund managers, also in the asset class of investors. We also need to train investors in the ecosystem on what it means to invest in the VC market. So when the EIF starts investing in this market, it gives a seal of approval for the fund managers it selects, helping to leverage also private money of the market. I think Henrik already kind of alluded to that, mentioning the professional investor that helps other investors come into the market as well. So when we started Equifund, I think out of the 9 fund managers, more or less 6 or 7 were first-time teams for us. So it has helped develop also that part of the market. I think we were there to entrust the first-time teams on the ground, helping them develop and build expertise. We always respect their full independence in investing and divesting decisions and independently managing their funds. This goes without saying, even for first-time teams. I think the Greek fund managers we supported will agree with me in saying that building the Greek VC and private equity ecosystem has been a common great educational experience for all of us on the ground.
Thank you very much. That's really very interesting to hear that you had so many first-time teams and that it was also a good learning experience in the end. The results are really impressive. So congratulations once again. And Henrik, can you tell us a little bit about how you selected your fund managers in the past?
Yeah, I'll maybe take a different tack a little bit than Vivi. She explains very much well, the kind of also standard that EIF sets in the European venture market in terms of selecting fund managers. I think that's very common across a lot of actors or LPs investing. For us as a managing authority, it's been, and I think Vivi also alludes to this, that a project like this spanning multiple years, kind of supporting policymaking, is a learning journey for everyone involved. And we started out, some 14, 15 years ago, building a new public investment organization from scratch. At that time, we could kind of designate that organization, or it was the term that we could designate that organization as recipient, an intermediary for the money. A number of years later, in our second generation, the strategy kind of evolved a bit, where the notion of investing then into new teams was a different kettle of fish. I mean, we had a public organization that had set up a number of funds, but we wanted more market-based funds in complementing that and the partnership with the EIF. And then that was very helpful because the EIF sets a high standard. That also means that it's demanding, in terms of a learning journey to work with the EIF. But it also means that you get all the professionalism that the EIF has in terms of the actual implementation and management of the mandate, which takes a lot of weight off our shoulders. And they're more experienced in, investing in the private market, still having, an openness to new teams, as Vivi mentioned, and so on. So you can kind of work there at the margins a little bit once again. But in 2016, there was some regulatory changes that clarified that you need a competitive tender, some sort of competitive process to assign intermediaries. And we'd already set up the second generation then, but the implementation of the first green fund was a bit late in starting, and that was affected by this. So that was actually procured in competition with one of Sweden's largest banks that wanted to bid for that offer. In the end, the public investment organization that we had support previously happened to win that mandate. And then fast forwarding to the latest generation, we've obviously done even more homework then on our new reality being procurement. And procuring venture capital is not exactly run of the mill and standard in the market. So that's been very interesting learning journey. But it's been a positive learning journey in terms of understanding how helpful EU regulation of procurement is. You need access to the expertise. But if you have access to the expertise, you understand what are the limits, but also the optionalities and the possibilities. And you have people helping you to navigate that. So in a consortium of resources, we've been able to navigate through that process and sort of put tenders and calls out into the market. We chose a negotiated procedure with a prior call. The difficulty here is if you want to define, especially if it's going to be something innovative, it's going to be very hard. If you want to define at the outset what this fund needs to be doing in order to evaluate it, you put yourself in a difficult position because you don't even know who's going to bid for it. And you don't have the flexibility of a more discretionary investment strategy like the IF has or process, where they can, check out the market, put out some feelers and figure out what they should be doing, and then you negotiate their way forward. But there are options like that in procurement regulation. So we chose a negotiated procedure where we had a call for interest to learn, okay, who might be interested? Okay, these organizations might be interested. That puts a different color on it a little bit. We could go deeper on this. We might have to be a bit lighter and broader in terms of these criteria. And then we put out the selection element where they applied to be in the process. And then we just checked for operational integrity, experience, and so on, that these organizations had some substance to them and the general capability of running this kind of operation and mandate. And then following that, we got even more feedback. And then we sort of started edging towards the actual bidding process of deciding, what criteria should set organizations apart and in line with maximizing policy utility. And that's when we could start to fiddle a little bit with, how much emphasis should we put on organizational strategy? How much on market strategy? And we ended up then having, quality-weighted pricing model where they bid on the price and they also bid on strategies for implementation. And then the price that they had chosen to bid with was adjusted by the level of quality in terms of how we value the strategies. And we got some good interest. We actually have our first private organization that won one of the mandates, but the instruments are still very much early days in implementation, and not all of them have been put to sea yet, have been christened, as it were. But we're just there at the cusp. But it's been a learning journey, and I think we put a lot of emphasis on organizational integrity to make sure that if we're going to direct invest, we don't want to do too much of the heavy lifting for them. They need to be ready and capable to run this kind of organization or operation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing. This is quite an innovative approach. We don't hear very often the full range of the public procurement procedures is looked at and really the most suitable chosen, which might not be the typical one, like the open tender, for instance. So thank you very much for sharing this insight. Very helpful. And what are the sweet spots of your fund managers, Henrik? At what stage, for instance, pre-seed, seed, are the companies that receive investments? What's the typical ticket size, just to get a little bit of a feeling?
Well, generally, you might say seed funding. I mean, the stage definitions vary now by markets and in a way that's a little bit less transparent and perhaps ideal to use these kind of terms. But our funds, you invest somewhere between 300,000 euros and €1 million, generally, on average. Our green mandates have an optionality as high as 7.5 million, which is not, their everyday business, but in order to be able to follow along a bit more. But the focus has been on seed stage and being there at the cusp of what the market is ready to handle, any potential gaps between angel financing and professional VC fund financing, where we try to create sort of instruments that can support and accelerate angel financing, while at the same time bridging to professional VC financing.
Thank you. And one of the topics that might inspire as well other authorities programming ERDF resources is how do you define, or did you use a definition of innovation? How do you define if a company is innovative or not?
Defining innovation, that's a heavy load. I think we've taken some tacks from kind of what ERDF talks about when it talks about innovation, and innovation in products, so new products, services, but also business models. I think that's the element that we maybe added in terms of coloring our instruments with supporting developing, circular business models and things like that, trends that have developed over the last years. So product, services, and business models, new innovations in that regard, I think is what we've instructed our instruments to try and look out for.
Can you maybe tell us an example of an innovative company that received investment through one of your equity instruments?
Yeah, I have one favorite example, which is RenewCell. It's a company that developed a process to enable better reuse of cotton and cellulose-based textiles in order to drive circularity in the textile industry. So that's a nice idea. It grew out of research labs at university, and it got pre-seed funding from kind of public university-related investment organizations prior to our instruments. But then as it was going to market, it happened that it was a promising product and it did have some traction, but they ended up in a financial situation which could have been detrimental to the company. I mean, cash flows can kill any company at any stage, and early companies even more. And our instrument was able to bridge that situation for this and then continue to follow on invest. And it ended up attracting venture capital and even going public. So that's really kind of an A to Z journey, but also illustrative of our instruments, taking an intermediary role between kind of sometimes angel capital, sometimes, for example, very pre-seed oriented university closed capital, and then the commercial markets. And not always just providing a volume of capital, perhaps being there at the right time, supporting a particular situation so that a promising company that just happens to be in a slump or a challenging situation doesn't have to die, but can and might scare off other investors at that point. But you can take a bet on a company like this and say, this is probably temporary. Let's dare to do it.
Thanks a lot, Henrik. Now, Vivi, do you see innovation in a similar way in EquiFund? How do you support innovative companies through EquiFund?
I think I will echo Henrik's, concerns on difficult to define innovation. I think he has a very fair point on product, services, and business models. I would just like to extend this in that it is so difficult to define innovation that I would just use an example that we had actually a Greek company that used a business model that is very, common in Europe, let's say. And the guys just actually pioneered it in a new market in the Middle East that was not common at all. The company was InstaShop, and it was our first successful exit of the EquiFund portfolio. So defining innovation is not always, very easy. You can be innovative in actually pioneering a new market with something that nobody has thought before you. You can be the first one anywhere, in a new product, in a new service, in the way you do a business, in the way you crack a new market. So it's not always easy to define innovation. Now, that said, that company was not even in the innovation window, by the way. It was early stage, but that's a different discussion. Now, that said, in the innovation window, for us, as I mentioned in the beginning, Greece has a very good track record of research centers and ideas. So under the innovation window, we really try to look into how it could help tech transfer, so how it could really help these ideas from the research centers and the universities go into commercialization. So under the innovation window, we try to have two main, let's say, compartments, quote, the technology transfer part, aiming to commercialize the results of these research centers, and a more acceleration part where we helped get ideas and initiatives already a bit cultivated, really bootstrapped and hitting the market. The tech transfer part, it was mostly targeted by two fund managers, and it was very hard work on their side as well. So it really required hands-on in getting the ideas out of the research centers in order to make them into more commercial products.
Thank you very much, Vivi. And do you have maybe any other examples that might be interesting to hear in terms of innovative company, just to get a feeling what kind of companies got investments?
Well, I think many, Anna, but I think inevitably we always turn into the success stories because these are our best examples. I think the first one that comes into mind is Augmenta. It's one of our most innovative and successful stories. It's also the one I use because it's not the usual suspect. So it's actually a company that thrived in the agricultural sector, which is not something you expect to hear in the startup ecosystem. So it's a company that developed a system that utilizes high-definition cameras to scan every inch of a field as the tractor drives through it, and then performs machine vision to identify the status of its plant in the field and control how the sprayer actually applies the amount of chemicals required on each inch of the field. So the company is actually on a mission to augment the capacity of arable land and help feed the growing population sustainably, and basically by automating the most impactful farming operations such as fertilization and pesticide spraying. So it's actually on a mode to sustainably grow our agricultural production. The interesting thing, it was founded by two young farmers that were just fresh out of the university engineering school. So the guys were not really out on a mission to create a company. They were just farmers. They started working and they just thought there must be a more efficient way of doing this, of fertilizing the ground, of using the pesticides, etc. So they built the company from scratch. So the company was actually entrusted by one of our early stage funds. Our fund was the first one to actually meet the guys and entrust the company back in July 2018. It was the first to participate in its first financing round of 600K at the time. Then 1 year later, the company raised 2.5 million. It kept growing, kept developing its product, its AI machine tools. 2 years later, it reached the point where it's raised its Series A of 8 million. And then in March 2023, so almost a year ago, it was acquired by a global leader in agriculture and construction equipment, technology and services for 110 million. I need to say that post-acquisition, the company remained in Greece. The acquisition money is used to build the team in Greece. So they are really expanding the team they have in Greece. And Augmenta is setting up the European Innovation Hub of CNH, which is the global leader that bought them out in Athens. So I'm just putting this out there directly because we always hear these concerns that these companies are bought out by global leaders and then we lose all the momentum. Actually, our experience is that when these companies reach that stage, they actually have enough leverage to keep their teams on the ground, to keep developing the R&D on the ground, and to build the innovation hubs where they were first founded. And we've seen this example in other innovative companies in Greece as well.
Thank you very much for sharing this example, and as well directly coming to one of the topics. I don't know if, Henrik, do you have a similar experience in terms of exits and global companies buying them out, but the company is actually staying in Sweden?
I would say that I don't have a check on the entire portfolio. We definitely have sort of trade sale exits and similar, because most of our capital is, general purpose venture capital. It's not necessary that it's companies that are sort of that prone to foreign acquisitions always. It gets a little bit more complicated when you get into clean tech. Now we're still early days in that, even in the first green fund cycle, it's just entered its harvesting period. So you could easily see, foreign acquisitions and so on there. I think a successful exit is a successful exit. Follow-on investments is a different kettle of fish philosophically. You can make money, you can be efficient with taxpayers' money and support companies and growth. But at the same time, we should complement the market. So we want to avoid that our funds, just follow on with evaluations and so on, where it's not entirely as obvious that it's not crowding out other potential capital and so forth. So an advantage that we have is that our funds are so relatively early stage that their exit market is mostly Swedish venture capitalist funds. So that are just a little bit later at growth funds. So in that regard, a lot of the portfolios kind of tend to stay close to home, but that's maybe not the end journey, for that company per se. But it does help a little bit in terms of us taking responsibility for that the companies, have the chance to grow and explore themselves in Europe. But it's becoming increasingly challenging in elements like more advanced technology like life science, clean tech, and deep tech, where there's an immediate international interest from abroad, even at pre-seed stages, which is a new animal to deal with.
Thank you very much. To switch to a little bit different topic concerning the beginnings, the very early beginnings of companies. So the current CPR provides broad possibilities to combine grants and financial instruments. And obviously through FICOMPAS, we look into that possibilities. It will be also one of the topics that our workshop in Athens will tackle. Now, from your experience, when you're much nearer to the life cycle of a company, are there any specific circumstances where startups might indeed need grant support, before or alongside an equity investment? investment. I don't know if you have a view on that, Henrik.
We think generally that's really interesting. I think it's an interest that's grown kind of in between programming periods, so we haven't put it to use yet, but we've been very curious about it for the last couple of years. And the reason for that is that it's quite an unusual offering in the market. Generally speaking, a market VC fund doesn't provide grants at all, obviously. It might loans and other kinds of financial contingencies and others that could be helpful. That's another kettle of fish. But especially when it comes to a couple of points, so financial literacy and investment readiness is generally poor, even in Sweden with a relatively developed financial market. So the competence obviously exists at a market level and clearly exists relatively well in concentrated financial centers. But if you talk about financial literacy for entrepreneurs in general, that is not democratically distributed. So that's something that we've been talking about a lot, and also exploring synergies. Without having blended instruments, we've sort of started having very fruitful discussions with program managers for the ERDF program. So could we, kind of synthesize blended instruments by having calls for financial literacy training in the regular ERDF programs that just happen to complement very well the financial instruments as such? Another specific market segment is coming back to kind of clean tech, deep tech, life science, where you have prolonged development cycles of companies. And one particular challenge is that even in the best of cases, when you have a really promising company, it takes time to develop. And even if it garners a lot of interest from investors, that can end up diluting the entrepreneurs very early, so that the entrepreneurs lose control, but also engagement into their creation. And that's not anyone's fault. It's almost mathematical logic kind of in the markets. But that's an interesting element where if you look at the EIC, for example, that combines grants and equity specifically for these kinds of target groups, I think it makes a lot of sense. We have a journey to go in terms of combining our slightly separated policy systems, because we have an innovation authority that provides grants to these target groups, and then we and others work on investments. And we could talk more with each other, I think, in terms of achieving focus for business policy initiatives and instruments at a broader scale.
Thank you very much, Henrik. For our listeners, maybe who are not familiar with the abbreviation, so EIC is the European Innovation Council. There's the scheme that combines basically grant support, and then there's also an investment component. And we will also feature this during our Athens event. So I'm very looking forward to the discussions about the complementarity as well, and maybe lessons learned from both sides. Now, Vivi, do you have maybe perhaps some companies in your portfolios that received investments from both equifund, but maybe also benefited from grant support? What's your view in terms of grant prior to equity investment, maybe for some specific types of final recipients?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think for this, grant to equity tool, we are all looking into it. We have all been discussing throughout this programming period, and I think we are all looking forward to the discussion also that will happen in Athens. There is a lot of anticipation for these discussions for the Compass events. There is a balance to be striken between grants and financial instruments, for sure. As I mentioned in the beginning, I don't think equity financing is the solution for everything. We do need to find middle ground on when a company needs to take grant, at what stage it becomes investable, at what stage of its life it needs equity financing, when it graduates to more traditional financing sources. We have had companies in the equifund portfolio that have received grants, not blending with equity, but we have had companies actually borderline the life sciences sector that received grants in their earlier investment stages. For example, Biopix, a company that commercialized a novel molecular diagnostic device for detection of acids. I will not go into the details because I don't know them, to be honest. It's very, very technical. So the guys received a grant from the Horizon program back in 2020 in partnership with other partners at the EU level. And it also received at a later stage equity financing from one of our fund managers in the innovation window, the Metavalon Fund. So indeed, companies can look into different financing options depending on their development stages, depending on how their product also develops and their needs and what part of their business plan they need to also support, because equity financing can also finance parts of the business development that grant might not be able to support as eligible expenses as well. And not to mention that equity financing is more about smart money. So equity financing is not only about getting money, but it's also about, quote, buying the experience of the fund managers, getting them into the game, getting them their expertise and knowledge and mentorship in terms of developing the product, in terms of opening new markets, in terms of helping them out in a million of other things, on product development, on marketing, on networking, on HR, on a million other things, depending on their expertise. Now, another point, and I think Henrik also mentioned that, is somewhere between grant and actually being VC investable lands the area of angel investments. That's also important. To be very honest, in Equifund, when we started the innovation window, we had targeted this part also in the innovation window. So we hoped that the innovation window would target this investment stage. In reality, the innovation funds provided tickets that were a bit bigger. So we did have a financing gap still in Greece for the business angels, let's say, area. And I think it's also important to mention here another initiative that we put on the ground a couple of years later. That's the Business Angel Co-Investment Fund. Now, that was a fund that was put on the ground to help the companies that were somewhere there in the middle, just to finance them, to make them VC investable. So to help very, very initial ideas actually bootstrap and get them to the VC pipeline. It was also a fund that has helped us make a significant boost for the business angel network in Greece that was a bit under the radar up until then. And one more point I would like to mention, that the Business Angel Co-Investment Fund was fully funded by reflows of the previous Jeremy mandate that the EIF had deployed in Greece. And this is super important to mention, that these ERDF initiatives, the equity financing initiatives or financial instruments initiatives in general, be it debt or equity, have this potential. This is the revolving nature of these instruments is super important for the public budget as well, because they bring back money to the public resources that then can be reused to finance SMEs for the same purposes or for more initiatives on the ground.
Thank you very much, Vivi, and really great to hear that also reflows were used in this regard. So it's hopefully as well of inspiration for others. Now, let's continue. Maybe when we look at the life cycle of a company, as a company that you invested in needs growth, it might need more investment. And Vivi, in terms of Equifund, your fund managers, do they already plan in resources for some potential follow-on investments for their portfolio companies, and how maybe to best plan ERDF resources for such follow-on investments?
Yes, and of course, follow-on investments are a prerequisite for companies to grow and fund managers basically to double down on their investments and ensure successful exits. This is the way, the market works. Follow-on investments are already foreseen in the investment strategy and the budget of any fund, and actually investment strategy of funds do not make sense without follow-on investments. Now, what is interesting is what you mentioned on how we kind of plan follow-on investments when we have ERDF resources coming into play. We inevitably need to consider the regulatory provisions and the requirements in how to plan these follow-on investments. The regulatory frameworks, as Henry mentioned, change in between the cycles of the EU budget, what we call between us the 7 years programming periods in terms of the terminology. The provisions do not always operate in our quote favor. There's usually a mismatch between this 7 years programming period and the life cycle of the funds that typically expands from 10 to 12 years. So I think as the EIF, we have the expertise required, and we have a very good cooperation and collaboration with the national managing authorities. We have a very good cooperation with the EC services, our DG Regio colleagues. So together, we always manage to figure out a way to make these initiatives, to align them to common market practice, because this is also important for the fund managers to have initiatives on the ground that are as close to market practice as possible in order to make their funds really deployable on the market.
Thank you, Vivi. And Henrik, how do you tackle the necessity of potential follow-on investments, or how your fund managers tackle that?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit the philosophical kind of background in terms of making sure that the handshake between the instrument and the market, which is gradual because you want co-investment along the way, but eventually when you're handing it over more or less to the market, or the market's increasing its participation, there's this element of, are you being complementary in your decision making? Then you have the element that Vivi mentioned of regulatory elements, where if you can't spend kind of approved costs beyond the programming period, then that puts a limitation on things. So per definition, most of our follow-on investments have come from, exit proceeds, sales of companies, partial or wholesale, that have funded more follow-on investments. We also have, escrow accounts and similar that can carry on a little bit of money from the programming period to the sort of holding period or the harvesting period. There is some kind of opening happening, I see, in the regulations on that point. It's now been possible to kind of start connecting previous instruments from previous periods with new ones, but I'm not sure that's entirely straightforward. It's in the vicinity of the right direction, but it's a limitation, but there's probably good reasons for why the regulators have put it that way. I would stress another element, which is that another challenge our instruments have is, or sort of opportunity as well, is that a maturing company that's starting to take on perhaps the next stage of investors, more longer term investors, also needs prior investors that, kind of are able to convey confidence in the company as this handover is happening. So presence of a professional investor once again kind of means they want to stay with the companies to make sure the handover to new kind of principal investors is a good one and they can support the company in that journey. So there's a lot of factors coming into play here. But generally, I would say that our managers have solved that in a pretty good way. There's always been resources following investments. We've had no red flags raised to us that we have no money for follow-on investments and we can't support this company and now we have a huge problem and so forth. It's any issues in that case are more related to kind of the force on exiting companies by a certain sort of when you want to close the fund. That's always a timing issue, whether that's easier or harder and whether the kind of follow-on capital is there or not.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Vivi, the leverage effect achieved by Equifund, we mentioned that already at the very beginning, is very impressive. How did you manage to ensure that the fund managers brought enough skin in the game to the table? And what's generally the key to success to ensure sufficient co-investment also on project level, for instance?
I think there are two separate things on this. Anna, fund managers' commitment, so what we call skin in the game, is a prerequisite for our funds. Our fund managers need to show that they are willing and ready to commit their own resources in order to ensure relevant alignment of financial interest with the other investors, be it private or public. Obviously, their level of commitment is assessed against and aligned with the fund size and the broader financial position of the team. So we're not being irrational there. We just want to make sure that they are willing to chip in the fund as well. Now, the leveraging of private investors, as you mentioned, it's also a prerequisite to any closing of the fund. The level of leveraging depends also on other technicalities like the state aid regime. Without going into technical details, this can vary from 10 to 30% of private investors being the minimum in order for the fund to reach first closing. It rests with the fund managers always to raise the private investors' money required in order for the fund to reach first closing. But as mentioned, what we usually see is that in the market is that when a team has successfully managed to go through the due diligence process of the EAF and the EAF has decided to entrust a team, it is typically a good sign also for other private and institutional investors to also trust the team, especially in such markets where the asset class might not be equally trained, or as Henrik mentioned, for other investors to also piggyback on our due diligence process when selecting a team. Now, for the next levels of financing rounds, it only depends on the company and how well it progresses and the products obviously it brings on the table. This is fully on the company's growth.
Thanks a lot, Vivi. And Henrik, anything different in Sweden in regards to that?
Well, maybe. I'm trying not to be controversial, but I think leverage is a double-edged sword. It's good when you're building markets and you're after volumes of capital and kind of growth in a broader sense. You can get leverage both when you're setting up an instrument at the kind of fund level. You can get it at the co-investment level for individual investments, and that kind of adds up. In our case, in the example of the partnership with EIF, we even had, like co-funding from EIF, to co-fund sort of the precious Swedish taxpayers' money or EU funds. And then we had, co-investors at funds on top of that, and then co-investment kind of at the investment level. That adds up to, enormous leverage. But when we work with our more publicly kind of run investments, it's also important that they don't take on more co-investment than necessary. If you have 90% co-investors, you can wonder whether the 10% stake was necessary at all, really, in the market. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword. I think between our instruments, we see everything from 3 to 10x our kind of ERDF funds, which is, pretty good. But we're also hesitant. A good example is, not diving into technicalities too much, but if you're in an attractive segment where if a company matures, it can attract a lot of capital, be it digital or perhaps, a successful clean tech case, you can end up in your harvesting period. Now, this might be, towards the later end of a fund post, like what we monitor from an EU perspective, but at the later stage of a fund, you can have enormous capital coming into an investment. And it looks like the investment has garnered, insane amounts of co-investment, but actually it's just a natural sort of progress of events. So looking at leverage and kind of volumes of co-investments as a whole, I'd say that more is not always better. I'd focus much more on the quality of co-investments. Like, are these investors necessary for the company to grow? Are they good to help shepherd the kind of onward growth of the company?
Henrik, if I may, I think this is, again, working on the margins of the markets. I think this is very interesting, the way you put it. This is a very good problem to have that we didn't have in the Greek case. Actually, the public money in the Greek case, especially in the innovation window, took almost 90% of the funds, and it was instrumental in putting the funds into place. So for us, it was never, a doubt in our mind that without the public money, none of this would have existed to start with. Now, yes, we had, very interesting companies that managed to leverage the money in the market. To be very, very open, I think nobody expected this much success in the market, especially so early on. But it definitely depends. I think you are completely right. It definitely depends on the market conditions as well. And what you mentioned, that there is a need for continuous assessment of the market in order to be continuously vigilant of whether the public resources do crowd out or crowd in private investors, is a very good point, and we all need to stay on top of that game as well.
Yeah, just to add, it's a good discussion to have, though, because it forces a slightly deeper discussion of policy relevance and so on, but the markets are completely different, just as you say. And let's remember the origins of venture capital, deregulation of Canadian pension funds that fueled the post-war industrial machine in San Diego, later becoming Silicon Valley. I mean, public capital has been absolutely instrumental in developing venture capital.
Thanks a lot for this exchange. And let's talk results. Did you have any unicorns that you'd like to share with us? Any interesting exits? Henrik?
We're short on unicorns, but we're also, once again, early stage exiting to VC funds. We haven't done a full evaluation. We just closed our first generation. So we're doing the full evaluations. It's going to be interesting to see where the companies are now. I think the potential for unicorns is definitely higher in kind of the green tech segment. But some parts of the policy machine talks a lot about unicorns. Our part of the machine talks a lot about industrial scaling. Now, whether that means that a startup in particular becomes a unicorn or not, if it plays a pivotal role in industrial scaling of climate innovation, we're pretty happy about that.
Very good approach. Thank you very much. And Vivi, how is it in Greece?
Yeah, we are sold on unicorns as well, especially from the Equifund portfolio. I mean, Greece is performing in terms of unicorn, but not from our portfolio so far. Again, we can provoke a discussion of whether you would prefer a unicorn over 10 companies valued 100 million, but that's a different discussion to have. We have been lucky enough to have already experienced a number of very successful exits in the Equifund portfolio, something nobody was expecting so early on in the investment period. We started having exits as early as 2020 from the Equifund portfolio. I could easily mention one prominent one that was IQ Sonos, that was founded in 2013. It's the world's pioneer in the development of AI in digital music production and processing. The company actually develops patented machine learning and AI technology to enable audio and video professionals and non-professionals to repair sound in their videos with the help of algorithms. It has been used, like the solutions of the company have been used by Grammy-winning producers. Now, what is interesting about this company, especially for the EIF, is that it's a company that was established, as I mentioned, back in 2013, and it actually got its first support also by one of the funds of the Jeremy mandate. So PJ Catalyst was there to support the company in its early years, and then the company, as it grew, obviously took money from other private investors and angel investors in Greece and outside of Greece, and it was then supported by the next generation of the Equifund funds that the EIF also supported with the Hellenic Republic money, namely Venture Friends and Big Buy Ventures. And in the beginning of 2022, news hit the ground that the company was acquired by Meta, the parent company of Facebook, which was very exciting for everybody. I understand the company still has offices in Greece and has a big part of the company has remained in Greece.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And we're also happy that a representative of this company will join us as well at the Athens event to speak a little bit from the company's perspective, what these investments, how they help them to grow. Maybe just to summarize, Vivi, what are your key lessons from all this experience in Greece and what are you involved in currently? I know that you're maybe working as well with RRF resources.
Yes, Anna, thanks. I think the key lesson derives from our experience, I think not only in Greece, but in all the other countries that are in more developmental states, let's say, in terms of their VC and private equity ecosystems, such as Bulgaria, Romania, Cyprus, is that the deployment of such developmental mandates in EU regions where equity financing is not standard practice or has not been in the past years, and in areas where that are lagging behind in financing innovative companies and startups, it is actually instrumental to ensure a level playing field and to supporting cohesion across Europe. So I think these mandates are extremely important. The support of such initiatives through public and EU resources, be it ERDF or RRF resources, wherever they come from, is key to these respects and creates also a virtuous cycle of financing, innovation, entrepreneurship, and commercialization of research ideas. We as the EAF, we are very proud to have supported and witnessed these ecosystems develop and now being mapped finally on the VC and private equity ecosystem. Again, maybe not at the level of our counterparts like Sweden, but, getting there little by little. This has been possible, obviously, through the continuous cooperation and collaboration with the national authorities, the EU colleagues, the fund managers on the ground, all the relevant stakeholders, the national promotional banks. Everybody has been a part of these endeavors, let's say, on the ground. And it is essential that these initiatives continue so that financing gaps are not created and we keep supporting the success stories we see as they scale up as well, so that the positive impact keeps evolving and going on the ground. Now, in terms of the future, I think I will go back to something actually Henrik said in the beginning. When these ecosystems actually grow, as he mentioned, when it gets more generic, then the market actually develops and it starts to have depth. And now in Greece, for example, the National Promotional Bank for Investment, HDBI, has actually taken over the more generic VC strategies, and it's supporting now funds that look into more generic investment strategies. And we, in cooperation with the Hellenic Republic, are actually looking into more thematic sectors. So we are starting to launch an initiative on life sciences, which we believe is a more prominent sector in Greece. And this could only have happened because of the ecosystem developing and evolving the past years in Greece, which is, I think, where Henrik mentioned they were in the second generation of their funds already some time ago. So you see, if you mirror the two markets, you can see that we are evolving to that direction. And for me, this is watching the ecosystems grow in all of these regions of Europe. It's something we are very proud of, and it's something that we are very, very hopeful to continue into helping the ecosystems succeed.
Thanks a lot, Vivi. And Henrik, what are your plans and ambitions for the future?
I think it's interesting it's a very interesting policy cycle that we have ahead of us the coming years, and a lot of things happening in the rest of the world around us. It's going to be interesting to see. It seems like the economy is partly growing like never before, and policy sort of supported parts, and other sectors in society that are not growing quite as much. And the role for kind of complementing the market, you can't afford a guessing game anymore. You have to be a little bit more sophisticated. So it puts more work on us, but we're happy for that. We're talking a lot about deep tech and clean tech these days. I think not enough about life science and health, because it's a strength for Sweden, not the least. And I think that the health questions will come around the corner in the next policy cycle. As the baby boomers start aging and so forth, it's going to be an important question. But it does pose some questions we've talked about here. Basically, how do we ensure that we have a lot of innovation in Sweden? More and more countries are catching up in terms of developing financial sectors. I'm really happy to hear about the segmental kind of focuses of the instruments going forward in Greece. That's very cool to hear, that you can look at sort of sectoral strategies in a relatively nascent market. But I think that exit markets and scale up capital for more kind of high tech is going to be something I know that ERDF talks about, but many others as well. And I think we talk a lot about sort of having a lot of capital for our future high tech unicorns, but I think there's other actors in the world that are always going to have more capital. I started thinking more recently about exit markets and kind of our European companies. Do we have a good enough collaboration between kind of the companies that already have access to markets and the innovators growing? We used to have that in Sweden, where the likes of, Ericsson, being previous world leaders, would vacuum the market for innovation, and that being very constructive. But these multinationals now acting on a global market, that connection is not quite as clear. But across Europe, we have amazing companies that could keep innovating and avoid being sclerotic and keep being competitive by a stronger partnership with innovation. And then venture capital and financing is just a part of the solution, but perhaps there needs to be a stronger meeting between kind of closing the funding gaps and also contributing constructively to kind of industrial development.
Thanks a lot. I mean, that's a great point to digest and to think about. And maybe it's a good moment as well to let our listeners as well a little bit of time to think about it as well before our event. And I would like to thank you very much, Vivi and Henrik, for all the insights that were shared today with us. It was really a very stimulating conversation.
Thank you very much, Anna. Great saying our experience from the borders of EU, North and South, and looking forward to welcoming all of you in Athens.
Thank you very much, and really excited to see you guys and everyone else and learn from you and what you're seeing in Athens.
And a big thank you also to our listeners for tuning in today to this episode of the FICOMPAS Jam Sessions podcast. I certainly learned a lot today, and I have a lot of food for thought, and I hope that this podcast was also helpful for you. Hopefully, see you soon at the FICOMPAS workshop in Athens on the 26th, 27th February, where both Vivi and Henrik will share even more insights as speakers. And for those who cannot make it, the slides from the event will be published after this event. And if you have any questions, we encourage you to get in touch through our email contact@fi-compass.eu. We look forward to hearing from you, and until next time, goodbye.